Do you have any idea how crazy you are?
You mean the nature of this conversation?
I mean the nature of you.
Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this episode, we will discuss what Jean Baudrillard refers to as the Lacanian Seduction. In order to cover this topic, we're going to be looking at where does the phrase the Lacanian Seduction come from. The Lacanian Seduction from three different points of view. That's going to be Jean Baudrillard's point of view, Gilles Deleuze's point of view, and the point of view of the history of philosophy. We're also going to look at what I'm referring to here as Lacan's ism cluster: surrealism, postmodernism, absurdism, and communism. Then we're going to be looking at the history of Lacan's seduction, especially its roots in Salvador Dali's paranoid critical method, or voluntary hallucination, as he often referred to it. And we're also going to look at this idea explicitly: what is the Lacanian seduction? It can be answered with the phrase Lacan's barred subject. We're going to talk more about what that means. We're also going to look at the non-clinical, that is the cultural, and the so-called clinical use of Lacanian psychoanalysis. One of the ways in which we can paraphrase this or summarize it is as weaponized absurdism for communism. We're also going to look at examples beyond the party line. We're going to look at examples that are not favorite examples of the Lacanians. So we'll take a look at women's rights, and we'll take a look at hot sauce. Lastly, we're going to be looking at this idea of the Lacanian shift. When you compare Lacan to Freud, you can see that Lacan brings about a number of shifts from, for example, from biology to sociology, from psychology to psycholinguistics, those types of things. But this one is particularly interesting in relation to the Lacanian seduction, and that is from the talking cure, Freud, to the training cure. So we're going to figure out what that means. I noticed that the Lacanians when they talk about the bar in Lacan, they claim that it's the same thing as erasure. They don't call it erasure, but that's what it's called in Heidegger and Derrida, and that's actually incorrect. So hopefully the Lacanians can correct that as well. But in either case, now we know. Also, they refer to the bar in the barred subject. They refer to the bar as liminality, or having something to do with liminality, which is a Jungian idea. Really, Joseph Campbell popularized this in regard to the Eleusinian mysteries and so forth. But the point just being is that is also a place where the Lacanians are incorrect when they associate the bar of the barred subject with liminality. Also, there's a curated further readings and bibliography that is available. All right, here we go. So the origin of the phrase, the Lacanian seduction, and the bar through the S, that line through the S is referred to as the bar. So you can see, and we'll see at the bottom of this slide, that the barred S refers to, that symbol refers to the barred subject, what the Lacanians call the barred subject. All right, so Jean Baudrillard coined the phrase the Lacanian seduction in his book titled Seduction. Very interesting book. If you've been following along in my comments about Jean Baudrillard, I absolutely love his book, The Perfect Crime, but his book Seduction is pretty good. There's some absolutely laugh out loud funny moments in there where he sort of points out the absurdity of many of these postmodern ideas. Many of the Lacanians, it seems, they don't really care for me, and I'm fine with that. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that I'm presenting other people's research on this. I'm showing you what Jean Baudrillard, for example, thinks about the Lacanians. I'm not telling you what I think about the Lacanians necessarily. I'm saying, look, what these experts have to say, these excellent French philosophers have to say about Lacan. Baudrillard refers to the Lacanian psychoanalysts as imposters. So we'll try to understand a little bit more as to why he refers to them as imposters. But primarily, many of the shifts that occur between Freudian psychoanalysis and so-called Lacanian psychoanalysis. That's what's behind and motivating Baudrillard here in many ways. Next, Baudrillard refers to Lacan's seduction as a Lacanian illusion. I think that it's very important if you think about, and I'm going to reference the presentation that I gave on Hegel's circular epistemology. If you think about Hegel's circular epistemology and you think about the way that it relates to Kant's critical philosophy, Kant's transcendental philosophy, then we see that Hegel is perpetrating what Kant would have referred to, or what Kant did refer to regarding his own philosophy, as a transcendental illusion. Kant says that it's possible to go down a certain path regarding transcendental philosophy that will lead you into a transcendental illusion, and Kant warns us against doing that. Hegel disregards Kant's warning and goes ahead and puts together a philosophy rooted in transcendental illusion. What we're going to see is that when Baudrillard refers to the Lacanian illusion, there's a deep sense in which this is rooted in Hegel's transcendental illusion. All right, here's a quote from Baudrillard's book, Seduction. He says, "The seduction, quote, always operates under the bar of the law and in the effigy of the master who rules with the word over hysterical masses unfit for pleasure." We're going to unpack that quote as we go here, but I wanted to go ahead and put it on the table to begin. What we're going to see here is that it's important to note that the seduction involves the bar and also this idea of being unfit for pleasure. We mentioned the S bar, and you can see that it refers to the barred subject. Also, I put a blurb down here, the definition of the word imposter, in case you wanted to see it. A person who pretends to be someone else in order to deceive others. And this also brings forth ideas of fraud. All right. So the Lacanian seduction from 3 points of view. So it's important, in my opinion, to keep in mind that these insights regarding Lacanian psychoanalysis were not discovered or invented by me. These insights have been openly circulating for at least half a century. In fact, if you go and look at the publication of many of the books that were commenting on Lacan in the 80s, they were saying things like, Lacanian psychoanalysis is done. It's over. We've already debunked it. We've already revealed it to be fraudulent. Despite those declarations, and despite the publication of all of those books by experts, you can just go read the back of the books on Amazon if you'd like. Despite all of that, there is a sense in which the fact that Lacanian psychoanalysts can fly under the radar, so to speak, and we'll talk more about this later, but the fact that they can fly under the radar has motivated a number of academics to form what they refer to as reading groups. They've gone on to sort of put together their own type of certification, and so they refer to themselves as Lacanian psychoanalysts. You can find people on LinkedIn referring to themselves as Lacanian psychoanalysts. So it's interesting that that type of motivation brought about, or has brought about, a kind of resurgence in these niche, boutique for sure, circles. I think it's important that we, therefore, look at the arguments as to why people were referring to Lacanian psychoanalysis as fraudulent, and why were people referring to Lacanian psychoanalysis as already debunked, right? How was it the case that they thought they already realized that this is not a good modality of psychotherapy, and yet we still see people claiming to be practitioners of it? In addition to Baudrillard, on the previous slide, we can add Deleuze's critique of Lacanian lack, and you'll see how this figures in or factors into the barred subject here in a moment. The critique of Lacanian lack, that is, the Lacanians don't understand difference. And that's just simply a fact. You can look at what the Lacanians say about difference, and anyone who understands Deleuze immediately knows and immediately recognizes that Lacan and the Lacanians don't understand difference. This is the same critique that we have in regard to Hegel as well. And so next here, the problems with Lacan can be traced philosophically back to the various ideas that he accepted and endorsed from Descartes and Hegel. So I want to stress this again. I pretty much stress it every single presentation that has anything to do with criteriology or ontology, that this is a powerful insight, and I think that we should understand this because it's so fundamental. For example, it's the first pattern that you should look for when reading a contemporary philosopher. So when I'm reading something philosophical, or I'm reading something that claims to be philosophy, the first thing that, it's so automatic with me now that I'm not even thinking about it, right? I just sort of do it. And that is, I start looking for how Cartesian or how Hegelian is this philosophy? Is this philosopher or is this author indicating that they are operating with a Cartesian or a Hegelian ontology? And if that's the case, well, then we know that, it's going to be riddled with problems. Okay, so here we go. Lacan's ism cluster: surrealism, postmodernism, absurdism, and communism. And again, hey, if you're in favor of communism, just find somebody better. This guy, Lacan, is not your man. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is something like, it doesn't really matter what side you're coming from, the right or the left. If somebody doesn't know what they're talking about, then they don't know what they're talking about. And as we'll see here, Lacan does not know what he's talking about. We'll just mention them here, and then they'll come back up again later. The cluster will become clear as we make progress, namely surrealism, which traces back to Hegel as the origin of Lacan's seduction, with its expressions and uses being postmodernist, absurdist, and communist. The history of Lacan's seduction. We see here Dr. Bruce Bowles' book, The French Hegel, or French Hegel, From Surrealism to Postmodernism. Here's a quote from the very first page of that book. The surrealists were drawn to Hegel's dialectical negations as a means of erasing the divisions between reality and the dream. So you can see why this not only would excite the surrealists, but of course also the psychoanalysts. After automatism as a surrealist method came Salvador Dali's method, originally called voluntary hallucination, then changed to the paranoid critical method. I found this article a long time ago, and I have referenced this article in book reviews and in a number of other places, but I really enjoyed this article. And this article is from someone who, it seems to me at least, I don't know this person personally, but it seems to me from other information that I've been able to gather, that this person is looking to give a charitable and favorable reading of Lacan. So I think that's important because, this is not somebody who has any kind of beef with the Lacanians, it seems, and yet they have these things to say. And they should have these things to say because they're true. So here we go. Since surrealism's inception, its members had characterized themselves as being in constant revolt against a society that reduced all human desires to market values, religious impostors, universal boredom, and misery. So you can see here that this is not just a critique of capitalism. Surrealism is not just a critique of capitalism, but it's also a critique of just inauthenticity in general, we might say. Captivated by Freud's theory of dreams as twisted images of socially repressed desires, the surrealists invented automatism as a tactic for releasing the unruly and chaotic imagery of dreams into the waking realm of everyday life. This is also referred to sometimes as automatic writing. You could say it's inspired by Freudian free association. Automatism proposed that the production of an image should abandon conscious control, and that the final product should register this in its formal makeup. As Dali puts it, quote, to systematize confusion and to contribute to the total discrediting of the world of reality, end quote. All right. Dali claimed that through a deliberate simulation of paranoia, right, anyone engaging in the paranoid critical method would be able to demonstrate that reality was not a fixed entity to which an individual responded, but rather a construct born out of that individual's comprehension of the world. And notice, of course, this is this idea of a method for the sake of being in constant revolt. In this manner, the paranoid critical method pointed the way to a critique of the symbolic realm as an integral part of any interrogation of social relations. Dalí's method theorized a calculated attack on bourgeois existence that would throw capitalism's efforts to portray itself as the universal standard for judging reality into confused disarray. Now, of course, capitalism need not be the only standard for judging reality, but we'll talk some more about that later, perhaps. Okay, we keep going here. Lacan visited Dalí in 1930 to discuss Dalí's work, The Rotten Donkey. After that, the psychoanalyst and the painter carried on a dialogue of sorts through articles published in the Surrealist press on the subject of paranoia, culminating in the 1932 publication of Lacan's doctoral thesis on paranoid psychosis as it relates to personality. This dialogue between Dalí and Lacan is telling in the similarities of the two theorizations of paranoia against current theories which considered it a natural physiological malfunction of the body. Both Dalí and Lacan conceived of paranoia as sociological. So notice already this shift from biology to sociology, which in general is the Lacanian reading of Freud. Far from analyzing Amy's paranoid sadomasochism as an aberration, Lacan astounded the medical world by suggesting that the same mechanisms were present in normal ego development. 4 years later, in his essay The Mirror Stage, Lacan would theorize that in normative ego development, as in paranoia, the self is constructed through a misrecognition of reality, in which the identification of the self with an other is key. So we're going to see what this means in a second here, but there's a lot packed into that statement. Thus, as Carolyn Dean notes, Lacan used Kojève's reinterpretation of the Hegelian dialectic to theorize what had already been implicit in his study of Amy's motiveless crime. It allowed Lacan to view her crime, her tragic struggle to be free of the other, at the same moment that she desires recognition from the other, as a metaphor for the process of normal human development, in which the struggle for freedom, for autonomy and subjecthood is inseparable from an ever unsatisfied, think of Baudrillard's unfit for pleasure, an ever unsatisfied desire for recognition. Lacan's concept of the self, then, is deliberately paradoxical, bound up in the inescapable tension between the repressed reality of its own fragmentation and the imaginary ideal of a coherent, unified self. This will make more sense here in a moment. Thus, desire, rather than liberating the self from the other, and we got to get clear on what the other means here, functions to induce a longing for freedom at the very moment that it undergoes repression. And unlike Breton's location of the truth of the self in the liberation of desire, Lacan located it in repression rather than freedom. Lacan located it in repression rather than freedom. All right. So let's finish off the history of Lacan's seduction here then. So Lacan, through incorporating Kojève into his rereading of Freud, rejected Freud's argument concerning the organization of the ego, the self. and we can argue about whether the ego is the self another time. I'm just reading portions of this article to you. By the reality principle. Okay, so Freud's argument concerning the organization of the self by the reality principle. And of course, the surrealists and Lacan here are in constant revolt against these interpretations of reality. And that was in favor of a schema that locates identity formation in a negative dialectic. Think about Dr. Bao's book regarding the relationship between surrealism and Lacan to Hegel, based on the misrecognition of reality. And basically, there's this one idea, and the Lacanians absolutely want to make hay with it. In the Lacanian scheme, reality is forever repressed, along with its central truth that human identity is defined not by unity and coherence, which is transcendental, but by fragmentation, alienation, and lack. There's also a deep sense in which Lacan is borrowing this idea of lack from Jean-Paul Sartre, but we don't have time for that at this juncture, maybe at another point. So absurdism then. Lacan's mathemes, in regard to absurdism, Lacan's mathemes can be compared to Dolly's discussion of cauliflower and rhinoceros horns on the Dick Cavett show. And here is the YouTube link. I'll try to remember to also put it in the description. But it's fascinating to see Salvador Dali in color on a talk show discussing the mathematical relationship between cauliflower and rhinoceros horns. It's also interesting to see how that video, it doesn't seem to have aged very well. But when you see this in English, Dali is speaking in English, you will be able to immediately recognize Lacan in what you're seeing. As we will see the idea that, quote, reality is forever repressed, that idea characterizes Lacan's seduction very well. And it depends on an either-or assumption regarding reality. So we're going to unpack that here in a moment. Here is another article that I'm just quickly excerpting some quotes from here. Again, I'm showing this to you so you recognize also that, I'm not coming up with this. So there's a significant and long tradition of people who are trying to debunk frauds like the Lacanians. So in this article is titled "A Striptease in Pink Limelight, Removing the Veil Between the Subjective and Objective." All right. So here is a quote from Dali's Unspeakable Confessions. In the Unspeakable Confessions, Dali writes, "I believe that the universe around us is a projection of our paranoia, an enlarged image of the world we carry within us. I think that the object our eyes isolate from the real, or that we invent, is a pure expression of our delirium crystallized." Now, I want to make sure that I point this out at this place here in the talk, and that is that it is possible. So when I hear Dali say that, the lights that go on for me are the following. I think to myself, that's one possible reading of Kant's Copernican revolution. So when you're trying to understand Kant, what you start to recognize is that there are several viable interpretations, or at least interpretations that are popular, that have become popular. It's probably the better way to characterize them. And so therefore, especially in these secondary sources, and when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I was just consuming all of this reading, all of this research, just like an animal. And so what you start to see, the picture that emerges, is that you begin to recognize it's possible to put together essentially a list of possible interpretations of Kant's Copernican revolution, and then it's possible to go into Kant's writings and identify all the passages that are either in support of or debunk these possible interpretations. And once, that's a great exercise in and of itself, because as you're doing that, there's a sense in which you're learning Kant, you're learning transcendental philosophy, you're learning the transcendental method, how to clearly and correctly and coherently think about it. So when I hear Dolly say this, I think, oh, well, I know that is a possible interpretation of Kant's Copernican revolution, and it's an incorrect interpretation of Kant's Copernican revolution. And so what that tells me is that the philosophy, Dolly is an amazing painter, right? But an amazing artist. I mean, how wonderful it would be if people still had, people wore mustaches like Dolly's and dressed up and wore capes. I mean, I think more people should wear capes on, talk shows. Dolly's a great artist, no doubt, but he's not a great philosopher. And so when he puts together this philosophical position, and, Lacan is a wonderful showman. Lacan's presentations can be mesmerizing at times, but Lacan's not a great philosopher. He's just not. And this is as evidenced by the fact that they're making these very simple mistakes. And so when you begin to see that, then you say, oh, well, this, the results of these simple mistakes are exponential. They reverberate throughout the entire rest of the superstructure, so to speak. So I think it's important to point that out. I think it's important to see how it is that I read that, how it is that sounds to me, so that then you can recognize, what it is that I'm thinking about whenever I'm reading these things. And that's the reason I'm saying that, is because that way you can just simply and quickly recognize these patterns. Very, very powerful ways to analyze texts. Okay, so as we go forward here, and this is the author of this article speaking in the first person, saying, although I do think Dolly preempted much of what Lacan would later discover, meaning that Lacan, like Freud, claimed to discover things that really other people had already stated. Freud is famous for doing this with Plato, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, at least. Despite all of that, Lacanian discourse, however, is undoubtedly more allied to academic endeavor, right? So, that's a fair assessment. Lacan, in his doctoral thesis of 1932, would also suggest paranoia as an alternative systematization of the process which determines normal perception. So there it is. I mean, you can see Dolly's philosophical position from Unspeakable Confessions is echoed right there in Lacan's philosophical position in regard to experience and in regard to perception as well. We're going to see this as it relates to the mirror stage, but already you can see. So the power of philosophy in many ways is the ability to recognize a pattern and then just see that pattern as it repeats itself. And so, for example, when we recognize that, well, here's a pattern in Lacan, that pattern came from Dolly, that pattern in Dolly is an incorrect reading of the correct philosophical method for relating to reality, and avowedly so with the surrealists, possibly avowedly so with Lacan as well, but avowedly so with the surrealists, So when you see all of that, then you realize, okay, well, Lacan is not the guy for getting things true, getting things right. Okay, next here, George Orwell, upon reading Dolly's autobiography. So upon reading Dolly's autobiography, which he refers to as simply a striptease act conducted in pink limelight, hence the title of this person's article, Orwell calls the artist, Dolly, as antisocial as a flea, end quote. And cites him as, quote, a symptom of the world's illness, end quote. I really thought that was valuable to include. And also then, you can see that by way of Dolly, you can see that Lacan is also a symptom of the world's illness. All right, so here we go. We looked at the history of the Lacanian seduction. Now we're looking at the ontology of it. What is the Lacanian seduction? So I wanted to put some slides together here, or some images together to reference the slides that I put together in Hegel's circular epistemology, and also in the presentation on nihilism. So if you see here, recall that we can make this distinction between mind internal versus mind external reality. And the conclusion that we were able to illustrate with Hegel is that Hegel does away with mind external reality. He's just not concerned with mind external reality. What he's trying to work out is a pattern within mind internal reality. Again, the extent to which that pattern depends upon his doing away with mind external reality is what constitutes the whole project, the whole superstructure, as a transcendental illusion, and ultimately what makes Hegel's philosophy nihilistic. So having said all of that, and I also included the slide, if you want, in the bottom corner there, you can read in Hegel's own words where he says, we're not trying to get mind external reality correct here. That is a claim and an idea that the surrealists, the absurdists, the postmodernists, the communists, the Lacanians, that claim just reverberates through all of them. Okay, so we see this image here of this infant seeing itself in a mirror, right? So what I've done is provide the graphics here so you can understand how Hegel's circular epistemology relates to Lacan's mirror stage. I really enjoyed this article. I think that especially when you're trying to understand Lacanian theory, there are so many performative type articles out there that really just, they're obscurist, they're absurdist, and so forth. It doesn't help you understand Lacanian theory. But I thought that this was one. There's several articles that I pulled together back in the day in order to finally come to a coherent understanding of Lacanian theory. And this article is very helpful. It's a very balanced article, but also it's direct. So it's called The Cabinet of Dr. Lacan from 1991. All right. And so taking a look at this, so you construct around Saussurean theory, linguistic theory, the most plausible account of how such symbolism is acquired. And so this will be referred to as the symbolic order. This will be referred to as the other, and so forth. But we're just trying to get started here. So, and from this psychoanalytic theory follows, Dr. Wollheim is quoting Lacan, everything, Lacan writes in The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis, quote, emerges from the structure of the signifier, end quote. Okay, so to assess Lacan's project, it is necessary to get the resultant theory into some kind of shape. And it is a good idea to think of it as layered like a cake. I really enjoy that way of visualizing it. At the bottom of the pan, Lacan places his account of the infant's entry into symbolism. Then he builds it up layer by layer. All right, so Lacan's account of the bad consequences of language or its alienating effect is borrowed, exaggerations and all, from standard Hegelianism. So there it is. You have it again. So at this point now, I'm standing with three different experts all saying the same thing about the relationship between Lacan and Hegel and locating surrealism in between. All right. So as Dr. Wollheim walks us through the 5 layers of Lacan's theory cake, suffice to say, Lacan's seduction is getting us to accept his characterization of what constitutes the first layer of the cake, namely humans, or, as the Lacanians like to make hay about, subjects, must enter into the terms of the law. So here we see this idea of the law again, that is, of the symbolic, in order to understand reality. So we'll have more to say about subject and subject constitution later, but for now, let's just say that subjects must enter into the symbolic order, must enter into the terms of the law if they are to understand reality. Now, this is a reading of Kant in a sense, because understanding. So when you have an experience of mind external reality, you encounter it initially through sensibility, and then through judgment, we understand sensibility. And the combination of sensibility and understanding produces an experience for us. Well, one way to interpret that is that, therefore, understanding is alienated from mind external reality. And so, therefore, whatever understanding we have of sensibility, it's not going to be an understanding of mind external reality. However, and on some level, that can seem intuitive. If you haven't actually done the work, I can understand why the Lacanians, they're the majority of them, in essence, nearly all of them, they didn't really study philosophy, they studied psychology. And so, I'm really not trying to, kick anybody presently. And so as a result of studying psychology and not studying philosophy, I think that you could hear that and it sounds intuitive. But when you study philosophy, you begin to realize that there's an implicit either or in there, right? And so, again, this is the logical way to approach why it is that the Lacanians are incorrect, but that's a much more difficult road to travel than this road that we're traveling. So we'll just stay on this road. But I just wanted to mention that we're still in the context of, it's possible to understand that we are still within the context of how to understand the transcendental method in relation to the experience of reality. I thought this was a great quote. Again, this comes from many people recognize the name William Richardson as a Heidegger scholar, a priest, Catholic priest from Fordham. And in this text, Lacan and Language, a reader's guide, he writes along with another author that between the doctoral thesis of 1932 and the mirror stage essay of 1949, so earlier we were talking about the doctoral thesis, there are only one essay and one article that are interesting because of their transitional nature. The first transitional essay dates from 1936, the same summer as the first unpublished presentation of the mirror phase, or the mirror phase theme. And this first transitional essay may be presumed to reflect a comparable level of development, and it bears the title Beyond the Reality Principle. So again, this idea of reality testing and the reality principle that we find in Freud have essentially been cast aside by Lacan and the Lacanians, and the justification for that is Dali and surrealism. Ultimately, also Hegel's circular epistemology. All right, so excellent. So now I think we've got a good grip on it. Here we go. So what is the Lacanian seduction? Lacan's seduction suggests that entry into the symbolic bars the subject from ever knowing reality as it is. Now, if you accept Lacan's theory of subject formation, then, like Hegel's circular epistemology, you will have been seduced into Lacan's surrealist, absurdist, postmodern, paranoid method, from which there is no exit. We see the barred subject here again, and thus the barred subject is Lacan's seduction. If you accept Lacan's theory of the barred subject, ultimately it is the bottom layer of the layer cake. It is this initial stage into the superstructure that is Lacanian theory, that if you accept that, then you have been seduced by Lacan, that you have accepted the Lacanian seduction. Notice this ever unsatisfied desire for recognition. Lacan's concept of the self then is deliberately paradoxical, bound up in the inescapable tension between the repressed reality of its own fragmentation and the imaginary ideal of a coherent, unified self. Okay, so again, the subject has to enter into the symbolic in order to understand, and yet doing that then bars the subject from ever truly understanding. Okay, so as we finish this off, the non-clinical, that is the cultural and the so-called clinical use of the Lacanian seduction. So now that we see how Lacan's seduction functions, look at how so-called Lacanian psychologists can wield it as a tool for manipulation. First, if you don't accept Lacan's seduction, then Lacanians will accuse you of, quote, disavowing the lack in the other, end quote. Now, working out all of Lacan's ciphers is truly unnecessary. Ultimately, that phrase from these Lacanians means that you don't accept Lacan's theory of subject formation. It's just that simple, right? It's a fancy way of saying that you refuse to accept that the mind-internal symbolic characterization of mind-external reality is ever unsatisfied, that is, lacking. Their typical next move is to point to something and claim that you use it to, quote, attempt to compensate for the flaw in the other, end quote. Notice they are again assuming the Lacanian seduction. Here it is referred to as the flaw or lack in the other. Similarly, the bar of the barred subject is also referred to as castration. So finally, they will identify whatever it is that they want to change about you or criticize about you as your attempt to fill the lack that, according to the Lacanian seduction, is unfillable. Thus, your inability to accept castration will always be the answer to whatever motivates you to, quote-unquote, compensate for a lack of satisfaction. Thus, they seek to castrate you. This is why Baudrillard said that the seduction always operates under the bar of the law and in the effigy of the master who rules with the word over hysterical masses, unfit for pleasure. Notice then what this accomplishes for the Lacanians. They occupy a position which assumes a negative characterization regarding reality, supposedly leaving others with two options. Option one, accept castration, that is, you are a barred subject. Or two, continue to be dissatisfied. Once you see this pattern, you realize Lacanian psychoanalysis amounts to nothing more than a series of variations on the Lacanian seduction. Let's consider some examples. Lacanian seduction weaponized absurdism for communism. One Lacanian recently argued that, quote, the capitalist discourse, end quote, may be understood as a belief in the existence of a solution to lack. You should already be able to hear it. Thus, under capitalism, the barred subject disavows castration by supposing it can purchase some product or experience to satisfy itself or, quote, make it feel complete, end quote. Of course, notice that anything could be substituted above for capitalism. So again, ostensibly, anything can be criticized from the position of the Lacanian seduction. They then blame some negative consequence and sincerely just pick anything, right? They can pick anything on the misguided attempt to fill a constitutional lack, that is, the Lacanian seduction. However, many of these Lacanians trust too much in the power of the Lacanian seduction. For example, I recently encountered the writings of a Lacanian analyst from the San Francisco school who, by way of the logic of the Lacanian seduction, claimed, evidently without even a smirk, that having a gold watch was sufficient to diagnose someone as a capitalistic sadist or as a sadist. Now, this is, of course, absurd. For example, there are countless reasons to possess a gold watch that don't involve some blind capitalistic or capitalist lust to satisfy an unsatisfiable primordial urge. For example, what if someone were to buy you a gold watch? Would you quickly throw it away lest you be considered a sadist? Would that make you a masochist? Are clinical psychologists not allowed to make a profit? Well, we know they disavow their own advice there. Does the doctor need a doctor? Now, I've worked in many clinical settings. You can go look at my clinical background on LinkedIn if you want to see it. I think maybe not even all of it is even listed there. But in either case, I've worked in a lot of clinical settings beginning in the 90s. So if anyone, and I mean this sincerely, right? If anyone were to suggest in those settings that, and they were being serious, that owning a gold watch was diagnostically sufficient, they would be laughed out of the building and looked upon as incompetent. So that's why people with English degrees can be, quote, Lacanian psychoanalysts, end quote. The only key prerequisite is drinking the castration Kool-Aid of the Lacanian seduction. Okay, so examples beyond the party line. We've just seen how the Lacanian seduction can be used in the postmodern culture wars to absurdly, that is surrealistically, critique capitalism in favor of communism. And there's the Lacan-isms. What about non-party line examples, right? How would the Lacanian seduction apply to things like women's rights or eating hot sauce? Notice, in regard to women's rights, if you think that the right to vote will make you feel complete, then of course you need a Lacanian analyst to help you castrate yourself. Thus, Lacanians can do away with women's rights. I mean, it's just one more futile attempt to fill a lack. Notice, a lack in the other. Notice, the one-trick nature of the Lacanian seduction fails to appreciate things like duty or honor or sacrifice or merit-based justice. Let's consider hot sauce. If you want to put hot sauce on food, then clearly you think that the hot sauce is going to make you feel complete. So you need a Lacanian analyst to point out your foolishness to you. Hot sauce won't make you feel complete. You're a barred subject. Now that we've seen how the Lacanian seduction works, we can see where it really pays off. And I thought also we could look at that definition of imposter again, a person who pretends to be someone else in order to deceive others, especially for fraudulent gain. All right. It's interesting to see that evidently for Lacanian analysts, owning a gold watch is sufficient for being a capitalist pig, sadist. But flying all over the world, or owning multiple properties around the world, or requiring schools to fly you first class and put you up in five-star hotels if they want you to give a presentation, well, none of that is capitalistic sadism, since, of course, Lacanians engaging in those activities have accepted their lack. What nonsense. Neither sophist nor charlatan is really sufficient a term. And I saw that there's some books published by the Lacanians titled things like Lacan the Sophist and Lacan the Charlatan. It doesn't change the fundamentally incorrect nature of Lacan's ontology. And, hey, if you want to keep looking for a corner in a round room and try to train others to be certified in looking for a corner in a round room, so be it. We should refer to the Lacanians as frauds. In regard to psychoanalysis, if in fact they are Lacanian, then as Baudrillard taught, they are imposters. Deleuze once famously said that he avoided Lacanians like the plague, and the fact that that's a pun doesn't change the fact that the Lacanian seduction is a fraud. Finally, notice how Lacan has changed Freud's talking cure into a training cure. The Lacanian analysts are quite open about this. Quote, disavowal of lack ensures suffering. The discourse of the analyst, then, is ultimately the antidote. Unfortunately, the alternative path of the discourse of the analyst is accessible only to those who engage in psychoanalysis. So to be clear, the only solution to dissatisfaction and suffering is to become not just any old psychoanalyst, but a Lacanian analyst. So every patient is really a trainee. The Lacanian Seduction.